us.
Wow. Wow, thank you, John. I am really excited to be here and to meet you all afterwards and hear more of the talks and hear more of the music as well. I am Rosa and I'm an academic and also a game designer at 3 Knots. Before I begin, just a show of hands, like who here would quite confidently say they play video games? Way. Who here says like they've played a video game here or there? Cool. Who here has like never played a video game or has no interest in video games? Way, great. So hopefully this talk will show you some games that you might find exciting or might want to explore later on. And also I'd like to highlight that all the landscapes that you will see in this talk, they're all from screenshots from actual games that have been created. So it's games like this one, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. In this game, I am playing as a detective and I'm investigating the disappearance of a small boy called Ethan. And the game begins in a tunnel and I come out onto this forest and onto this beautiful vista, which I'm later going to have to explore and see all the ghosts and traces to find out where this boy has gone. But in this moment, it looks like almost like a standstill because the sun is rising and it's glimmering and it feels beautiful and I'm at this moment of the sublime. And I like to highlight the sublime is the feeling of expanded thought and greatness. It's at the center of nature and also the center of romantic art. And it's not defined by beauty, but by a perception of vastness and something powerful and great. We feel the sublime when we see something that's bigger than ourselves. So kind of imagine like a tiny boat out at sea in the lost, trying to find its way home, and it's facing waves as tall as this building. Or like in The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, where I'm watching out over the sunrise, and it's glimmering out all the way to the horizon. That's the feeling of the sublime. And video game developers, they create worlds, like whether in teams of hundreds or to just 2 people or maybe even just 1 person. Like they spend years in their studios creating these beautiful places. They're sculpting, literally sculpting and painting every tiny detail until they create worlds as big as an island or as big as Greater London or maybe even as big as a universe. In the Arrestor, I am exploring an island. It's a Hebridean island, also beautifully designed and created. There's just me in this landscape and the voice of a narrator. That's reciting to me is poetry on top of a beautiful score. And all these landscapes, what the designers are trying to do, they're trying to succumb me to these emotions that they're trying to express. And I will gladly join them in that. But again, the sublime is not the beautiful. It's also the terrifying. Kentucky Route Zero, it follows the story of characters drifting along. They're lost in a magic realist landscape. Conway, which is the main character, is tasked with delivering a parcel. But in order to get to his destination, he has to go through Route Zero. No one knows how to get to that route. So he must open these magical portals and ask these strange characters how to get to his destination. They're all small. They're all small characters in these vast landscapes. And they're dealing with mysterious and magical forces. And they're much larger than they are, whether they be monsters or gods or just simply forces. And these are created by developers. They have the power to destroy and completely control my will within this game. A good show of the terrifying is in the Shadow of the Colossus, where I'm playing a tiny male character that's galloping across this vast plain to come across these massive giants. They're like the size of the Shard, like a single footstep could like just squish me. And if they pick me up, I'm no bigger than their little finger. And to beat them, I must crawl up them as they're like stomping through this massive landscape and cling on to their life as I climb up their towering figures. until I get to the top. And only when I get to the top can I bring them tumbling down. Life is Strange. It's a beautiful game. It's about a teenage girl who discovers that she has the power to control time. And as she uses her power originally to save her best friend from death. And as she's playing with these forces of nature, nature starts to realize and starts to retaliate with all its wrath. And so inside the game, I am brought up against these like terrifying vistas of like beached whales and double moons, and eventually also a hurricane. And my character is powerless against that. And I am too. I am terrified with the sublime design that these game designers have made me feel, because I am this character. I am tiny. And I'm dealing with powers that are much bigger than myself, and at the mercy of the game designers that have created these worlds. So we understand that the sublime is when my mind has trouble grasping something vast and powerful, but also obscure. Like, these games that I've been showing you, they find strength in that obscurity. Again, on the island of Dear Esther, where Dear Esther is set, the narrator always talks in metaphors and analogies. It's hard to understand him. And one moment he talks about a hermit that used to live here that came on a boat without a bottom. And then I hear the whizzing sound of the saw cutting through mangled car, then scars. I see scars on the landscape, like the soil itself is a manifestation of something larger, a bit more terrifying. And I begin to question whether this island is even real or a figment of someone's imagination. It's a really ambiguous story, and it's hiding its answers on purpose in the landscape, behind the mist and on the horizon. So I need to keep exploring it in order to find the answers. Everyone's Gone to the Rapture is another game by the same creators of Dear Esther, a game that I highly recommend everyone plays. It's absolutely beautiful. And in this game, we enter a beautiful village in Shropshire, but it's abandoned. Instead of people, we see these strange glowing orbs of light. And if you get closer to them, you can hear them whisper and like scream or maybe even sing. And if we follow them, we end up finding out that the people that inhabited this town have been disappearing one by one into an ether of light. And we are following their ghosts. We're following their ghosts in their final moments as they try to come to terms with their own mortality and the fact that they eventually as well are going to turn into ethers of light. So whether terrifying or awe-inducing, the characters in this game are dealing with forces neither they nor I understand, and the game also never reveals what it is. It's in that obscurity and in that ambiguity that game developers and game designers, they have the power to create magical experiences that are infinitely beautiful and mysterious as well. But with the power to create the sublime also comes the power to dominate. Bioshock Infinite, this game, revolves around a floating city of Columbia. It was founded by a self-proclaimed prophet called Comstock, and he controls this city over this like bird, big, huge metallic bird, watching over the city. The cityscape really is just vast, but also oppressive. It promises a utopia that was literally built on thin air. Similarly, in London, I walk past these monstrous shopping malls like Westfield near my house, and these like beasts of skyscrapers, and they bend down and peer at their citizens like they're, like they're oppressing them. It's disorientating. It's an architecture that is designed to frighten and to make the self feel small and powerless and also confused. But really the sublime, it's an invitation to a challenge. Even if it's terrifying, it's a challenge. In the game Journey is a game where I play a tiny character in this vast, desert. And when I walk past up the first sand dune, I come across this mountain out in the distance, and I know I have to reach it, but it seems so far away. And these landscapes, they're designed by game developers to build a picture of what the world is and who you are in that world. And then, later on in the game, they completely shatter that framework. And they ask you, they challenge you to become bigger than yourself. They terrify us with these vast landscapes so we can learn to embrace them, become bigger, and overcome them. So when I stare up at the Barbican, I remember what video games taught me about overcoming the terror of the sublime. So when I'm playing with unknown forces that I do not understand, that are bigger than myself, I look for what makes the landscape human. I look for the stories in the landscape. And how they fill these gargantuan buildings with little stories, with life, and with vigor. So I take the landscape step by step. In Journey, I am flying and tumbling through it. And flying through a desert that in the end was never really a wasteland in the first place. It's filled with monuments and stories of an old civilization that lived there. And I enjoy each obstacle as like a tiny journey up the mountain. In London, what I do is I walk London. I walk it to stitch together places that I do not know, to better understand its landscape. So bit by bit, London starts becoming familiar, and I can begin to love it. I can begin to love the spectacle that it is. So when I reach the end, I can look back at all the landscapes that I've gone through, and I can begin to understand it better. Scale starts coming into perspective, and the vastness that it once was no longer overpowers me, as my sense of self has grown to overcome it. And what seemed like a vast wasteland is actually now filled with stories and experiences. And I feel enlightened, and maybe even how video games have made me feel, reborn. I emerge stronger and wiser and greater. But at the end of the day, the sublime is it's a challenge. It's a challenge for us to then overcome the sense of vastness and become bigger ourselves. And by playing the video game, I can begin to understand what's around me. I can begin to take on that challenge. I can walk the territories of London step by step and turn these what seems like beasts and monsters into something more human and re-emerge a bit enlightened. And that's how I overcome wastelands. Thank you.
The question I have is, do you think that as video games have evolved and they've become more, rather than a doing experience, more than just a simple experiencing, do you think that is something we're going to see a lot more of? Is that the kind of games you want to see, rather than I feel now when I play a video game, when I get to a section I have to do a puzzle, that feels like, I'd rather just walk out and experience stories, just simply connecting, that maybe I'm involved in them as a character, maybe I'm not, but do you think that's a problem in the fact that it's maybe affecting the transmission with that kind of action rather than the simple just being there?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that games have struggled for a while. People always thinking, well, there was a big debate whether games were stories or whether they were something, structures and systems. And sometimes games had to feel like they had to prove themselves against film and against, all these other mediums that were, trying to say, no, that is games. So, but now I feel a lot of studios are opening up to the idea of not necessarily having to fit into a mold of what a game is. And so they're starting to listen more about the idea of maybe just enjoying being in that space or enjoying just exploring and not feel like they have to shoehorn in a bit of mechanics to feel like, oh, now we can call ourselves a game.
Right, one follow-up question of that.
Sure.
How do you think film particularly can learn from gaming rather than the other way around, that gaming is learned, in terms of those experiences being inherent to what's being presented within the film rather than...
That's interesting because usually it's the other way around. It's like, oh, what kind of games? I mean, for me, it's about the detail of landscapes and like making a place feel more like a place. And also kind of seeing the audience as more of a player in the actual story. Which, you know, in a game, you're just writing the script for a game and then handing it in to the players and then saying, okay, now you do with it what you want. So it's never, at the end of the day, it's never what you intended to experience. And so games have gotten really good at kind of accepting, oh, okay, well, I've designed this, but maybe the people won't understand it that way in the end. I feel film also can learn from that and say, maybe, okay, I've created this film, but not everyone will interpret it their own way. And that's okay. They can interpret it in the way they want.
So you've spoken mostly about walking simulators, as
yes.
they refer to. I also happen to like this genre, but a lot of games journalists, as we'll call them, don't like walking simulators. How does that make you feel about listening to these people? Usually men in their late 30s.
Yeah, like that.
Ooh.
So that comes from the same place as that feeling that, no, games are this, and we must protect games that are this. Is that feeling of kind of games being under threat and therefore having to be a certain way to protect themselves. And I think walking simulators are amazing, and they're what games, you know, they are kind of like the avant-garde of games. They're trying to accept that games can be something more, something different. So yeah, don't listen to the journalists. I don't like them. It's wonderful that there's different types of games.
When were you first aware of an environment or a landscape in a game? So obviously they were very rudimentary when they first began, slowly building worlds in a more graphical style. What was the first time that it clicked for you?
So I studied architecture before I went into games. And when I first started enjoying the landscape of games was when I was in second year of architecture, and I wasn't really enjoying what architecture was out there for me once I graduated. And playing games, I started realizing that these environments, they were designed in a similar way that architects were that I was designing buildings in architecture school. And yeah, I was playing Assassin's Creed at the time, and I was climbing up these buildings that I went to visit and I've always loved, and like, oh, I'm at the top of this building and doing these things I couldn't do in real life. And that's where it kind of clicked for me that there was this whole design also in virtual space.
Have you gone back and looked at older games to sort of trace it back to when that sort of began, when sort of worlds were being created? Because I'm thinking of, I'm an old sod, so I remember a lot of these games in the early days, but games like Manic Miner on the Spectrum, I've never considered it as a landscape, but that's what they were creating. They were creating these environments, these landscapes, constructing them like a building that you had to traverse. And just listening to your talk sort of made me reevaluate what those games were. So have you gone back to any of those early games and had a look at those?
Yeah, you could almost say that the screen itself was the landscape. And even so, as far as, I forgot the name of the game. But let's like, yeah, I just forgot it. But let's just say Space Invaders. That alone can be seen as a landscape, right? Where you kind of are traversing left and right, and it's telling a story at the same time where they're coming up from above. You can interpret it as a landscape, as long even if it is just 2D or one plane.
What do you prefer, the filmic experience or the real simple experience like Tetris?
As a game. I prefer the more filmic experience, and that's because so far filmic experiences have told story better to me at the moment, but that's the current state of games at the moment. I think we're still trying to figure out how to evoke story and emotion strongly through mechanics, and it can be done. There's a really good game called Brother: A Tale of Two Sons, in which you control each brother with each different joystick. And spoilers, at one point, one of the brother dies. And at that point, you're only playing with one joystick and the other one's just laying motionless on the joystick. And that's such a strong feeling. That's mechanics that convey emotions really strongly. And while there's some games that are getting there, it still needs much more movement at the moment.
About sort of films and games, and there's the game called Quantum Break, which is it merges, for people not aware of it, it kind of merges, like, it's a game and then suddenly it's like you watch a live action bit after like a chapter. I don't know, how do you feel about that? Like, in terms of, it's almost like it's merging two things together. I don't know whether to play it, or how do you feel about that?
So that comes from a time when games didn't know how to do story, or like how to tell stories. So games they do this thing where they grab the 3 acts of theater and they put the first act and the last act as cutscenes, as film. Well, they used to. And then they kind of have the repetition of the middle act where you beating this level and overcoming obstacles and taking the action. So that comes from that. They didn't know how to say, okay, how do we do exposition in a game? But that's something that now people have learned how to do, and with intros and with exploring the story through the mechanic.